After Joseph and his brothers and family died, the people of Israel had lots and lots of children. A new king of Egypt began to rule, and he became afraid of the Israelites and thought they would fight him to take over the land. So he made them slaves and used them to build the cities of Pithom and Raamses. The king hated the Israelites so much he commanded the baby boys must be killed, but 2 Hebrew midwives, called Shiphrah and Puah, feared God more than the king and hid the baby boys so they would be safe. There was a man from the Levi tribe, and he and his wife had a baby boy. The woman hid their son for as long as she could, but eventually she had to find another way to protect him. So the woman made a basket of bulrushes and covered it in slime and pitch to make it waterproof. Then she put the baby in the basket and placed it near the reeds. The sister of the baby stood some way off to see what would happen to him as he floated in the river. And the daughter of Pharaoh came to wash herself, and when she saw the baby she sent her maid to bring him to her. When the baby started to cry, Pharaoh's daughter felt love for the child, and she realized it was a Hebrew baby. Then the sister of the baby came along and asked Pharaoh's daughter if she would like a nurse to take care of the baby, and the princess agreed to this. So his sister brought her mother to look after her own son. The baby grew and was brought up as the son of Pharaoh's daughter in the royal palace, and was taught all the knowledge of the Egyptians. And the princess called his name Moses because she said,
I drew him out of the water.
When Moses grew up, he left the palace and went to see the Israelites who were his people. He saw one of the Egyptians hurting a slave. Moses was so angry that when he thought no one was looking, he killed the Egyptian and buried him under the sand. The next day 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and Moses tried to stop the fight and bring peace between them, but the men were angry.
Will you kill us like the Egyptian?
They said. Moses realized they knew the terrible thing he had done, and he was afraid. Now when Pharaoh heard what Moses had done, he ordered him to be killed, but Moses ran away into the desert of Midian. Moses came to a well in the desert to drink from. Some girls came along to water their flocks, and shepherds tried to drive them away, but Moses came to their rescue and gave drink to their animals. When the father of the girls heard what Moses had done to help them, he invited him to his home, and over time he gave his daughter Shiphrah to be his wife. Moses looked after the sheep belonging to Jethro, his father-in-law, who was a priest of Midian. One day he led the flock across the desert to the mountain of God called Horeb. As he was looking after the sheep, Moses saw a flame of fire set a bush alight, but the fire did not destroy the bush. The bush kept burning. Moses went to see this amazing sight, and heard the Lord speak to him out of the flames. God told Moses to take off his sandals because the ground he stood on was holy. So Moses obeyed. Then God said to him,
I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Moses was very afraid. God said,
I have seen how my people suffer as slaves in Egypt, and I am going to free them and take them to a land I have promised to give them. It flows with milk and honey. You will go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go.
But Moses was afraid and thought that the Israelites would not believe him. God told him to say that I am sent him. To prove that they would be delivered, God ordered Moses to throw down the rod in his hand. Immediately it turned into a serpent. Moses was terrified, but the Lord then told him to pick it up by the tail, and it became a rod once more. But Moses was still afraid, and so God gave him another sign.
Put your hand inside your cloak.
When Moses did, it became white with leprosy, a terrible skin disease. Then when Moses put his hand back inside his cloak, it became normal again. But still Moses made excuses.
I am a poor speaker,
he insisted. God was angry now, and he told him that Aaron, his brother, could speak on his behalf. Finally Moses was ready to do what God had said. God told him that at that very moment Aaron was already traveling to meet him. Moses left the burning bush with the rod in his hand. He would use it to show the signs of God to Aaron and the Israelites so they would believe. Moses returned to his father-in-law Jethro to say goodbye, and then headed for Egypt. Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and set off for Egypt with the rod of God in his hand. Along the way he met his brother Aaron, who was very glad to see him again. Moses told his brother everything that God had said, and all the signs he had performed. And when Moses and Aaron arrived back in Egypt, they had a meeting with all the elders of Israel. Aaron told them everything God had said, and performed the signs that Moses had seen at the burning bush. The people believed what they were told. They knew that God had seen their suffering, and wanted to help them. So they bowed their heads and worshipped him. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh to ask him to let God's people go so they could worship him in the wilderness. Pharaoh said,
No.
He had a hard heart and would not let the people go. He wanted to keep the Israelites as his slaves. Pharaoh then told his taskmasters to make the Israelite slaves work even harder. Not only did the slaves have to make bricks, but they also had to find the straw they needed too. The Israelites had to work harder and harder. And when they didn't make enough bricks, the taskmasters beat them. The elders of Israel came to Moses and Aaron and began to complain how cruelly all the Israelites were being treated. They blamed Moses and Aaron for making their lives worse by telling Pharaoh that God had said he must let the slaves go. So Moses prayed to God and asked him why he had allowed Pharaoh to cause trouble for the Israelites, and why did he not rescue them? God answered that he would deliver them from the Egyptians, and bring them to a land he had promised to give them. In the promised land they would be free. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh again, and asked him to let God's people, the Israelites, go. To show God's power, Aaron threw the rod he was holding to the ground and it became a snake. Pharaoh's magicians used their magic to make their rods become snakes too. But Aaron's snake swallowed up the other snakes. God is more powerful than anyone, but even after seeing this miracle, Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh again. This time Aaron struck the river Nile with his rod, and the water turned to blood, and all the drinking water in Egypt became blood red too. The magicians of Pharaoh used their magic to do the same thing. Pharaoh would not listen to God or let the Israelite slaves go. The water was turned to blood for 7 days, and then God caused another plague to come to Egypt. This time he commanded Aaron to stretch out his rod over all the rivers and streams. Suddenly frogs appeared, and sprang out all over the land. They were everywhere, even in Pharaoh's palace. Pharaoh begged Moses and Aaron to stop the plague of frogs, and they did, but Pharaoh would not listen to God and let his people go. So, God told Aaron to stretch out his rod again over all the dust of the land, and it turned into lice. The lice appeared on all the Egyptians, including their magicians, who warned Pharaoh.
This is the work of God.
But Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let the Israelite slaves go. So, God sent Moses to warn Pharaoh that swarms of flies would pester him and all the people of Egypt. but no flies would appear in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. Once again Pharaoh begged for the flies to be taken away, and God took them away, but he still refused to free the Israelite slaves. So, God sent another plague. All the animals of the Egyptians became ill and died, but the animals of the Israelites were kept safe. Even after all this, Pharaoh refused to obey God and let his people go. Next, God commanded Moses to take some ashes from a furnace and throw them in the air in front of Pharaoh. Horrible boils appeared on all the Egyptians, and the magicians suffered so much from them. They could not stand before Moses. But still Pharaoh refused to free the Israelite slaves. So next God sent a plague of big hailstones to rain down on the places where the Egyptians lived, but not on Goshen, where the Israelite slaves lived. The big hailstones destroyed the animals belonging to the Egyptians. But even after this terrible storm, Pharaoh still refused to let the slaves go. So God sent another plague on the Egyptians because of Pharaoh's disobedience. A swarm of locusts covered the whole land and ate all the fruit on the trees and herbs and everything green in the fields. But even after all the crops were eaten, Pharaoh shook his head and said
No
to releasing the slaves. So God told Moses to stretch out his hand, and deep darkness covered the land of Egypt for 3 days. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelite slaves lived, they enjoyed the sunlight. Pharaoh knew that God was more powerful than anyone or anything, but still he refused to let God's people go. There had been 9 plagues so far. What would God do next? God sent 9 plagues on the land of Egypt, and then Moses and Aaron went to see Pharaoh for one last time. Pharaoh's heart was still hardened, and he would not let the Israelites go.
Get out of here, and if I see you again, I will kill you,
he warned them.
Just as you say,
replied Moses.
you will never see me again.
Moses had warned Pharaoh that at midnight the final plague would kill the firstborn son in every Egyptian family, even among the animals, but the Israelites would be kept safe. He also told the people to ask the Egyptians for their gold and silver, and they gave them their treasures because they believed Moses was a very great man. Then God told the Israelites they must choose a lamb or a goat for each family and sacrifice that evening. Then they were to sit and have a special meal that would become a special festival to be celebrated every year. Some of the blood of the animal had to be painted on the top and sides of the doorpost in the house where they lived. That night, the Israelites had to eat the sacrificed animal along with some bitter salad greens and bread without yeast. They had to roast it over a fire, and any that was not eaten had to be destroyed. When the terrible plague passed over the land, those whose homes were covered by the blood were kept safe. At midnight the terrible plague killed the firstborn son in each Egyptian family, including Pharaoh's son. Everybody was crying and felt very sad, including Pharaoh. In the middle of the night Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron.
Go and take your people with you, along with your animals, but bless me as you go,
he ordered them. Finally they could leave. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for 430 years, but now it was time to go. Thousands of people all marched together with their families and animals out of the land. God had kept his promise to set them free. When God set his people free from being slaves in Egypt, he led them into the wilderness towards the Red Sea. By day he led them in by pillar of cloud. Then, at night, God led them by a pillar of fire. God did this so that they could travel during the day and during the evening. Pharaoh had finally let them go, but then changed his mind. He wanted them back as his slaves.
Why have we let them go?
He asked.
We need them to serve us.
So he gathered together all his soldiers and chariots and chased after the Israelites. He found them camped by the Red Sea. He had them trapped. But God was looking after his people. God told Moses to lift up his rod, and as he did so, the Red Sea parted. There was a dry path through the sea for them to cross to the other side. They all made it safely to the other side. Pharaoh and his men moved forward to the shore, and saw the path God had made through the sea. They decided to rush along it to capture the Israelites. God told Moses to raise his rod again, and right away the Red Sea flowed again to cover over all the Egyptians, and they were drowned. When Moses and the Israelites saw how God had protected them, they began to sing a song of praise to him. God had rescued them and they were free.